Oh, John, hey. I'm going to switch over to this. Hi, John, how are you doing? I haven't seen you in a while. How have you been? Hope everybody in your life has been staying safe and healthy and far away from fires. That's good. Yeah, I don't know if any of the fires are near you. We luckily don't have any near us this year, knock on wood. Um, I'm just really hoping that we don't have a return of last year where we had to sort of prepare go bags. I mean, we still kind of have them packed just in case, but it wasn't nearly as close. So we didn't, it wasn't. Uh, it depends, like year to year. This year it's been earlier because it's been hotter and drier earlier. Yeah, yeah. Last year was scary. But, we made it through. All of my coworkers made it through. I don't think I know anybody who lost anything in the fire, but I know a lot of people did. Obviously, one of the lovely things about living in California, you know, I made sure. I don't remember if I've seen you since. One of the people who was kind of in charge of the first part of the week at work, she left like very suddenly. It was like, hey, in 10 days I'm gone. And I sort of became the person in charge the first half of the week. So I'm like, you know what? The libraries around here have all of the pamphlets that say, hey, fire safety, here's the things you need to know and do and stuff. So I brought some of that to work and sent an email. Just so, people have the information. But I'm glad to know that you're, just chilling, that nothing bad's going on over there. Yeah. Well, it's awesome and also very exhausting. I'm not used to being in charge. So that's why it went from 3 story times a week to 2 story times a week. Yeah, we were all kind of thrown for a loop. I was kind of prepared for it because I knew that she wanted to move down to the city and stuff like that. She'd been talking about it for a while, so I kind of processed that. But yeah, it was very, very sudden, and I don't know. It does suck because all of a sudden, yeah, it goes. My manager, who's been there for 21 years, it'll be 21 years this year. Me, who's been here 17 years. And then our next most experienced person has been there a year and a half, and then 1 year, and then a half a year, and then a whole bunch of people who've just been hired this year. So it's been a thing. Actually, I think we have 2 people at a year instead of 1 at a year, 1 and a half a year, because, a half a year would be this year technically. So, but it was kind of cool because our crew that we had hired when, everybody else who was experienced left was a really great crew, very supportive, it was nice to not have cliques and stuff like that. Although now we just lost 2 of them, so it's been an evolution at our bookstore this year. But we have a lot of really great people, so yeah. But I don't know, I on purpose made sure that I didn't wear this shirt the rest of the week because this kind of worked with the Secret Garden-esque thing, even though it's technically Anne of Green Gables, but hey. Let's see, is that, yeah, that sort of centered it a bit more. And then I have my fancy butterfly tiara. I have 2 different kinds of butterflies that I do, though this is the fancy one where it's just teardrops put together. And then the other one is fold over a piece of paper and you draw a heart with one of the straight lines at the end, and then you fold it out and it's a butterfly. And I don't remember if I made a tiara of that. If I have, it's buried somewhere. But yeah, these are the ones that fit more with the Secret Garden theme. And I know technically I did this last year, but that was on my laptop with the old program that, yeah, it's really wasn't good quality, so now I get to do it again. Should you see my little... I was just thinking, Kickin' Stars hasn't redeemed random fact in a while. Speaking of Kickin', we'll see if they join sometime during story time, because I have to open my Red Bull. Hey, that was almost perfect. It's too bad the cup holder wasn't on the other side. Oh well, yeah. Anyways, let's go ahead and get started. So we'll make Maestro hide here. Oh, he's already left the room. Alrighty. Ah, that's right. I remember seeing this chapter title at the end of last story time. So I do know the answer to my tweet. Yes, she will. Chapter 7. The Key of the Garden. 2 days after this, when Mary opened her eyes, she sat upright in bed immediately and called to Martha, "Look at the moor! Look at the moor!" The rainstorm had ended, and the gray mist in the clouds had been swept away in the night by the wind. The wind itself had ceased, and a brilliant, deep blue sky arched high over the moorland. Never, never had Mary dreamed of a sky so blue. In India, skies were hot and blazing. This was of a deep, cool blue, which almost seemed to sparkle like the waters of some lovely bottomless lake, and here and there, high, high in the arched blueness, floated small clouds of snow-white fleece. The far-reaching world of the moor itself looked softly blue instead of gloomy purple-black or awful dreary gray. "Aye," said Mary with a cheerful grin. "The storm's over for a bit. It does like this at this time of the year. It goes off in the night like it was pretending it had never been here and never meant to come again. That's because the springtime's on its way. It's a long way off yet, but it's coming." I don't know why she suddenly turned Irish, but she's Yorkshire. I'm trying to get my Yorkshire dialed in here. "I thought perhaps it always rained or looked dark in England," Mary said. No," said Martha, sitting up on her heels among her black-laced brushes. Not the sort." "What does that mean?" asked Mary seriously. In India, the natives spoke different dialects, which only a few people understood, so she was not surprised when Martha used words she did not know. Martha laughed as she had done the first morning. "There now," she said, "I've talked broad Yorkshire again like Mrs. Medlock said I mustn't. Not of the sort means nothing of the sort," slowly and carefully. "But it takes so long to say it. Yorkshire's the sunniest place on earth when it is sunny. I told thee that'd like the moor after a bit. Just you wait till you see the gold-coloured gorse blossoms and the blossoms of the broom, and heather flowering all purple bells, and hundreds of butterflies fluttering, and bees humming, and skylarks soaring up and singing. You'll want to get out into the sunshine and live out on it all day like Dicken does." "Could I ever get there?" asked Mary wistfully, looking through her window at the far-off blue. It was so new and big and wonderful, and such a heavenly color. "I don't know," answered Martha. "Thou's never used thy legs since thou was born, it seems to me. Thou couldn't walk 5 mile. It's 5 mile to our cottage." "I should like to see her cottage." Martha stared at her a moment curiously before she took up her polishing brush and began to rub the grate again. She was thinking that the small, plain face did not look quite as sour at this moment as it had done the first morning she saw it. It looked just a trifle like little Susan Ann's when she wanted something very much. "I'll ask my mother about it," she said. "She's one of them that nearly always sees a way to do things. It's my day out tomorrow, and I'm going home. Ah, I'm glad. Mrs. Medlock thinks a lot of Mother. Perhaps she could talk to her." "I like your mother," said Mary. "I should think thou did," agreed Martha, polishing away. "I've never seen her," said Mary. "No, thou hasn't," replied Martha. She sat up on her heels again and rubbed the end of her nose with the back of her hand as if puzzled for a moment. But she ended quite positively. "Well, she's that sensible and hard-working and good-natured and clean that no one could help liking her, whether they'd seen her or not. When I'm going home on her to her on my day out, I just jump for joy when I'm crossing the moor." "I like Dicken," added Mary. "I've never seen him." "Well," said Martha stoutly, "I've told thee that there's very birds like him, and the rabbits, and wild sheeps, and ponies, and the foxes themselves. I wonder," staring at her reflectively, "what Dicken would think of thee." "He wouldn't like me," said Mary in her stiff, cold little way. "No one does." Mary looked reflective again. "How does thou like thyself?" she inquired, really quite as if she were curious to know. Mary hesitated a moment and thought it over. "Not at all, really," she answered. "But I never thought of that before." Martha grinned a little, as if at some homely recollection. "Mother said that to me once," she said. "She was at her wash-tub, and I was in a bad temper and talking ill of folk, and she turns round on me and says, 'Thou young vixen, thou! There thou stands saying thou doesn't like this one, and that doesn't like that one. How does thou like thyself?' It made me laugh, and it brought me to my senses in a minute." She went away in high spirits as soon as she had given Mary her breakfast. She was going to walk 5 miles across the moor to the cottage, and she was going to help her mother with the washing and do the week's baking and enjoy herself thoroughly. Mary felt lonelier than ever when she knew she was no longer in the house. She went out into the garden as quickly as possible, and the first thing she did was to run round and round the fountain-flowered garden 10 times. She counted the times carefully, and when she had finished, she felt in better spirits. The sunshine made the whole place look different. The high, deep blue sky arched over Misselthwaite as well as over the moor, and she kept lifting her face and looking up into it, trying to imagine what it would be like to lie down on one of the little snow-white clouds and float about. She went into the kitchen garden and found Ben Weatherstaff working there with 2 other gardeners. The change in the weather seemed to have done him good. He spoke to her of his own accord. "Springtime's comin'," he said. "Canna thou smell it?" Mary sniffed and thought she could. "I smell something nice and fresh and damp," she said. "That's the good rich earth," he answered, digging away. "It's in the good humour making ready to grow things. It's glad when planting time comes. It's dull in the winter, and it's got naught to do. In the flower gardens out there, things will be stirring down below in the dark. The sun's warming 'em. You'll see bits of green spikes sticking out of the black earth after a bit." "What will they be?" asked Mary. "Crocuses and snowdrops and daffydowndillies. Has thou never seen them?" "No, everything is hot and wet and green after the rains in India," said Mary. "And I think things grow up in the night." "These won't grow up in a night," said Weatherstaff. "They'll have to wait for 'em. They'll poke up a bit higher in here and push out a spike there more there, and uncurl a leaf this day and another that. You watch 'em." "I'm going to," said Mary. Very soon she heard the soft rustling flight of wings again, and she knew at once the robin had come again. He was very pert and lively, and hopped about so close to her feet and put his head on one side and looked at her so slyly that she asked Ben Weatherstaff a question. "Do you think he remembers me?" she said. "Remembers thee," said Weatherstaff indignantly. "He knows every cabbage stump in the garden, let alone the people. He's never seen little wench here before, and he's bent on finding out all about thee. There's no need to try to hide anything from him." "Things stirring down in the dark in that garden where he lives?" Mary inquired. "What garden?" "What garden?" grunted Weatherstaff, becoming surly again. "The one where the old rose trees are." She could not help asking, because she wanted so much to know. "Are all the flowers dead, or do some of them come again in the summer? Are there ever any roses?" "Ask him," said Ben Weatherstaff, hunching his shoulders toward the robin. "He's the only one who knows. No one else has been inside it for 10 years. 10 years was a long time, Mary thought. She had been born 10 years ago. She walked away, slowly thinking. She had begun to like the garden just as she had begun to like the robin and Dicken and Martha's mother. She was beginning to like Martha, too. That seemed a good many people to like when you were not used to liking. She thought of the robin as one of the people. She went to her walk outside the long ivy-covered wall over which she could see the treetops, and the second time she walked up and down, the most interesting and exciting thing happened to her, and it was all through Ben Weatherstaff's robin. She heard a chirp and a twitter, and when she looked at the bare flower bed at her left side, there he was hopping about and pretending to peck things out of the earth to persuade her that he was not following her. It's just kind of like a cat when it's reaching for your fruit and you look down. It's like, I was going to lick my paw this whole time. That's exactly what I meant. But she knew he had followed her. The surprise so filled her with delight that she almost trembled a little. "You do remember me," she cried out. "You do! You're prettier than anything else in the world." She chirped and talked and coaxed, and he hopped and flirted his tail and twittered. It was as if he were talking. His red waistcoat was like satin, and he puffed his tiny breast out, and he was so fine and so grand and so pretty that it was really as if he were showing her how important and like a human person a robin could be. Kind of reminds me of the Scarlet Pimpernel. Mistress Mary forgot that she had ever been contrary in her life when he allowed her to draw closer and closer to him, and bend down and talk and try to make something like robin sounds. Oh, to think that he should actually let her come as near to him as that! He knew nothing in the world would make her put out her hand toward him or startle him in the least tiniest way. Yes, it is in the least tiniest way. Very interesting. He knew it because he was a real person, only nicer than any other person in the world. She was so happy that she scarcely dared to breathe. Okay, I'm going to open my Red Bull. Here's my ASMR. The flower bed was not quite bare. It was bare of flowers because the perennial plants had been cut down for their winter rest, but there were tall shrubs and low ones which grew together at the back of the bed, and as the robin hopped about under them, she saw him hop over a small pile of freshly turned up earth. He stopped on it to look for a worm. The earth had been turned up because a dog had been trying to dig up a mole, and he had scratched quite a deep hole. Mary looked at it, not really knowing why the hole was there, and as she looked, she saw something almost buried in the newly turned earth. It was something like a ring of rusty iron or brass, and when the robin flew up into a tree nearby, she put out her hand and picked the ring up. It was more than a ring, however. It was an old key which looked as if it had been buried a long time. Mistress Mary stood up and looked at it with an almost frightened face as it hung from her fingers. "Perhaps it has been buried for 10 years, she said in a whisper. "Perhaps it is the key of the garden." Chapter 8. The Robin Who Showed the Way. She looked at the key quite a long time. She turned it over and over and thought about it. As I have said before, she was not a child who had been trained to ask permission or consult her elders about things. All she thought about, the key, was that if it was the key to the closed garden, and she could find out where the door was, she could perhaps open it and find out and see what was inside the walls, and what had happened to the old rose trees. It was because it had been shut up so long that she wanted to see it. It seemed as if it must be different from other places, and that something strange must have happened to it during 10 years. Besides that, if she liked it, she could go into it every day and shut the door. And she could make up some play of her own words and play it quite alone, because nobody would ever know where she was, but would think the door was still locked and the key buried in the earth. The thought of that pleased her very much. Living, as it were, all by herself in a house with 100 mysteriously closed rooms, and having nothing whatever to do to amuse herself, had set her inactive brain to working, and was actually awakening her imagination. There was no doubt that the fresh, strong, pure air from the moor had a great deal to do with it. Just as it had given her an appetite, and fighting with the wind had stirred her blood, so the same things had stirred her mind. Oh, sorry about that. That's my drawer. It's very creaky. This is a very old desk. I have to find out where I was. I think this desk is probably not quite 100 years, maybe 75 years old. Let's see. Just as it had given her an appetite, and fighting with the wind had stirred her blood. Yes, I'm rereading some parts. So the same things had stirred her mind. In India she had always been too hot and languid and weak to care much about anything, but in this place she was beginning to care, and to want and to do new things. Already she felt less contrary, though she did not know why. She put the key in her pocket and walked up and down her walk. No one but herself ever seemed to come here, so she could walk slowly and look at the wall, or rather at the ivy growing on it. The ivy was the baffling thing. Howsoever carefully she looked, she could see nothing but thickly growing, glossy, dark green leaves. She was very much disappointed. Something of her contrariness came back to her as she paced the walk and looked over it at the treetops and sighed. It seemed so silly, she said to herself, to be near it and not to be able to get in it. She took the key in her pocket when she went back to the house, and she made up her mind that she would always carry it with her when she went out, so that if she ever could find the hidden door, she would be ready. Mrs. Medlock had allowed Martha to sleep all night at the cottage, but she was back at her work in the morning with cheeks redder than ever and in the best of spirits. "I got up at 4 o'clock, she says. It was so pretty on the moor, and with the birds getting up and the rabbits scampering about and the sun rising. I didn't walk all the way. A man gave me a ride in his cart, and I did enjoy myself." She was full of stories of the delights of her day out. Her mother had been glad to see her, and they had got the baking and washing all out of the way. She had even made each of the children a dough cake with a bit of brown sugar in it. "I had 'em all piping hot when they came in from playing on the moor, and the breakfast and the cottage all smelt of nice, clean, hot bacon, and there was a good fire, and they just shouted for joy. Our Dicken, he said our cottage was the best and was good enough for a king." In the evening they had all sat around the fire, and Martha and her mother had sewed patches on torn clothes and mended stockings, and Martha had told them about the little girl who had come from India, and who had been waited on all her life by what Martha I will not say what Martha called them, because that is racist. Unfortunately, they were taught racist ways back then, taught that people in India were not their equals, and all of that stuff, unfortunately, comes into the story sometimes. So we will say natives. had been waited on all her life by natives until she didn't know how to put on her own stockings. They did like to hear about you," said Martha. "They wanted to know all about the natives and about the ship you came in. I couldn't tell 'em enough." Mary reflected a little. "I'll tell you a great deal more before your next day out," she said, "so that you will have more to talk about. I dare say they would like to hear about riding on elephants and camels, and about the officers going to hunt tigers." "My word!" cried delighted Martha. "It would set 'em clean off their heads. Would thou really do that, miss? It would be same as a wild beast show like we heard they had in York once." "India is quite different from Yorkshire," Mary said slowly as she thought the matter over. "I never thought of that. Did Dicken and your mother like to hear you talk about me?" "Why, our Dicken's eyes nearly started out of his head. They got that round," answered Martha. "But mother, she was put out about your seeming to be all by yourself like. She said, 'Hasn't Mr. Craven got no governess for her, nor no nurse?' And I said, 'No, he hasn't, though Mrs. Medlock says he will when he thinks of it. But she says he mayn't think of it for 2 or 3 years. "I don't want a governess," said Mary sharply. "But mother says you ought to be learning your books by this time, and you ought to have a woman to look after you." And she says, "Now, Martha, you just think about how you'd feel yourself in a big place like that, wandering about all alone, and no mother. You do your best to cheer her up," she says, and I said I would. Mary gave a long, steady look. "You do cheer me up," she said. "I like to hear you talk." Presently Martha went out of the room and came back with something held in her hands upon her apron. "What does thou think?" she said with a cheerful grin. "I've brought thee a present." "A present!" exclaimed Mistress Mary. How could a cottage full of 14 hungry people give anyone a present? "A man was driving across the moor peddling," said Martha, "and he stopped his cart at our door. He had pots and pans and odds and ends, but mother had no money to buy anything. Just as he was going away, our Lisbeth Ellen called out, 'Mother, he's got skipping ropes and red and blue handles.' And mother, she calls out quite sudden, 'Here, stop 'em, mister. How much are they?' And he says, 'Tuppence.' And mother, she been fumbling in her pocket, and she says to me, 'Martha, thou's brought me thy wages like a good lass, and I got 4 places to put every penny, but I'm just going to take a 2pence out of it to buy that child's skipping rope.' And she bought one, and here it is." She brought it out from under her apron and exhibited it quite proudly. It was a strong, slender rope with a striped red and blue handle at each end, but Mary Lennox had never seen a skipping rope before. She gazed at it with a mystified expression. "What's it for?" she asked curiously. "For?" cried out Martha. "Does that mean they've not got a skipping ropes in India, for all they've got elephants and tigers and camels? No wonder most of 'em's..." "Nope, we're not saying that. This is what it's for. Just watch me." And she ran into the middle of the room, and taking a handle in each hand, began to skip and skip and skip, while Mary turned in her chair to stare at her, and the queer faces in the old portraits seemed to stare at her too, and wonder what on earth this common little cottager had the impudence to be doing under her very noses. But Martha did not even seem to see them, and she went on skipping and counting as she skipped until she had reached 100. "I could skip longer than that," she said when she stopped. "I've skipped as much as 500 when I was 12, but I wasn't as fat then as I am now, and I was in practice." Mary got up from her chair, beginning to feel excited herself. "It looks nice," she said. "Your mother is a kind woman. Do you think I could ever skip like that?" "You just try it," urged Martha, handing her the skipping rope. "You can't skip 100 at first, but if you practice, you'll mount up. That's what mother said. She said nothing will do her more good than skipping rope. It's the sensiblest toy a child can have. Let her play out in the fresh air, skipping, and it'll stretch her legs and arms and give her some strength in 'em. It was plain that there was not a great deal of strength in Mistress Mary's arms and legs when she first began to skip. She was not very clever at it, but she liked it so much that she did not want to stop. "Put on those things and run and skip out of doors," said Martha. "Mother said I must tell you to keep out of doors as much as you could, even when it rains a bit, so as thou wrap up warm." Mary put on her coat and hat and took her skipping rope over her arm. She opened the door to go out, and then suddenly thought of something and turned back rather slowly. "Martha," she said, "they were your wages. It was your 2 pence, really. Thank you." She said it stiffly because she was not used to thanking people or noticing that they did things for her. "Thank you," she said, and held out her hand because she did not know what else to do. Martha gave her hand a clumsy little shake, as if she were not accustomed to this sort of thing either. Then she laughed. "Thou'rt queer old womanish thing," she said. "If thou'd been our Lisbeth Ellen, thou'd have given me a kiss." Mary looked stiffer than ever. "Do you want me to kiss you?" Martha laughed again. "Nay, not me," she answered. "If thou was different, p'raps thou'd want to thyself, but thou isn't. Run off outside and play with thy rope." Mistress Mary felt a little awkward as she went out of the room. Yorkshire people seemed strange, and Martha was always rather a puzzle to her. At first she had disliked her very much, but now she did not. The skipping rope was a wonderful thing. She counted and skipped and counted until her cheeks were quite red, and she was more interested than she had ever been since she was born. The sun was shining, and a little wind was blowing, not a rough wind, but one which came in delightful little gusts and brought a fresh scent of newly turned earth with it. She skipped round the fountain garden, and up one walk and down another. She skipped at last into the kitchen garden, and saw Ben Weatherstaff digging and talking to his robin, which was hopping about him. She skipped down the walk toward him, and he lifted his head and looked at her with a curious expression. She had wondered if he would notice her. She wanted him to see her skip. "Well," he exclaimed, "upon my word, perhaps thou art a young un after all, and perhaps thou's got child's blood in thy veins instead of sour buttermilk. Thou skipped red into thy cheeks as sure as my name's Ben Weatherstaff. Wouldn't believe that could do it." "I never skipped before," Mary said. "Just beginning. I can only get up to 20. "Keep on," said Ben. "Thy shape's well enough at it for a young un that's lived with heathen." Another misconception that they taught, unfortunately, in those days. "Just see how he's watching thee," jerking his head toward the robin. "He followed after thee yesterday. He'll be at it again today. He'll be bound to find out what the skipping rope is. He's never seen one. Eh," shaking his head at the bird, "a curiosity. Yeah. The curiosity will be the death of thee some day if that doesn't look sharp." Mary skipped round all the gardens and round the orchard, resting every few minutes. At length she went to her own special walk and made up her mind to see if she could skip the whole length of it. It was a good long skip, and she began slowly, but before she had gone halfway down the path, she was so hot and breathless that she was obliged to stop. She did not much mind, because she had already counted up to 30. She stopped with a laugh of pleasure, and there, lo and behold, was the robin swaying on a long branch of ivy. He had followed her, and he greeted her with a chirp. As Mary had skipped towards him, she felt something heavy in her pocket strike against her at each jump, and when she saw the robin, she laughed again. "You showed me where the key was yesterday," she said. "You ought to show me the door today, but I don't believe you know." The robin flew from his swinging spray of ivy on to the top of the wall, and he opened his beak and sang a loud, lovely trill, merely to show off. Nothing in the world is quite as adorably lovely as a robin when he shows off, and they are nearly always doing it. Mary Lennox had heard a great deal about magic in her Aya's story, and she always said that what happened almost at that moment was magic. One of the nice little gusts of wind rushed down the walk, and it was a stronger one than the rest. It was strong enough to wave the branches of the trees, and it was more than strong enough to sway the trailing sprays of untrimmed ivy hanging from the wall. Mary had stepped close to the robin, and suddenly the gust of wind swung aside some loose ivy trails, and more suddenly still she jumped toward it and caught it in her hand. This she did because she had seen something under it, a round knob which had been covered by the leaves hanging over it. It was the knob of a door. She put her hands under the leaves and began to pull and push them aside. Thick as the ivy hung, it nearly all was a loose and swinging curtain, though some had crept over wood and iron. Mary's heart began to thump, and in her hands to shake a little in her delight and excitement. The robin kept singing and twittering away and tilting his head on one side, as if he were as excited as she was. What was this under her hands, which was square and made of iron, which her fingers found a hole in? It was the lock of the door, which had been closed 10 years, and she put her hand in her pocket, drew out the key, and found it fitted the keyhole. She put the key in and turned it. It took 2 hands to do it, but it did turn. And then she took a long breath and looked behind her up the long walk to see if anyone was coming. No one was coming. No one ever did come, it seemed, and she took another long breath because she could not help it, and she held back the swinging curtain of ivy and pushed back the door, which opened slowly, slowly. And then she slipped through it and shut it behind her and stood with her back against it, looking about her and breathing quite fast with excitement and wonder and delight. She was standing inside the secret garden. Let's see. Just taking a little... Do. Sorry, just seeing if I could report, and it is okay, there we go. We have a couple of bots in the chat. Alrighty. Sorry about the huge pause there. But we will continue now. Chapter 9, The Strangest House. It was the sweetest, most mysterious-looking place anyone could ever imagine. The high walls which shut it in were covered with the leafless stems of climbing roses, which were so thick that they were matted together. Mary Lennox knew they were roses because she had seen a great many roses in India. All the ground was covered with grass of a wintry brown, and out of it grew clumps of bushes, which were surely rose bushes if they were alive. There were numbers of standard roses, which had so spread their branches that they were like little trees. There were other trees in the garden, And one of the things which made the place look which made the place look strangest and loveliest, was that climbing roses had run all over them and swung down long tendrils which made light swaying curtains, and here and there they had caught up each other, or at the far-reaching branch, and had crept from one tree to another, and made lovely bridges of themselves. Sorry, itchy nose. There were neither leaves nor roses on them now, and Mary did not know whether they were dead or alive, but their thin gray or brown branches and sprays looked like a sort of hazy mantle spreading over everything, walls and trees, and even brown grass, where they had fallen from their fastenings and run along the ground. It was this hazy tangle from tree to tree which made it all look so mysterious. Mary had thought it must be different from other gardens, which had been left all by themselves so long, and indeed it was different from any other place she had ever been in her life. "How still it is," she whispered. "How still." Then she waited a moment and listened to the stillness. The robin, who had flown to his tree-top, was still as all the rest. He did not even flutter his wings. He sat without stirring and looked at Mary. "No wonder it is still," she whispered again. "I'm the first person who has spoken in here for 10 years. She moved away from the door, stepping as softly as if she were afraid of awakening someone. She was glad that there was grass under her feet and that her steps made no sound. She walked under one of the fairy-like gray arches between the trees and looked up at the sprays and tendrils which formed from them. "I wonder if they are all quite dead," she said. Is it all a quite dead garden? I wish it wasn't." If she had been Ben Weatherstaff, she could have told whether the wood was alive by looking at it, but she could only see that there were only gray or brown sprays and branches, and none showed any signs of even a tiny leaf bud anywhere. But she was inside the wonderful garden, and she could come through the door under the ivy any time, and she felt as if she had found a world all her own. The sun was shining inside the 4 walls, and the high arch of blue sky over this particular piece of Misselthwaite seemed even more brilliant and soft than it was over the moor. The robin flew down from his tree-top and hopped about or flew after her from one bush to another. He chirped a good deal and had a very busy air, as if he were showing her things. Everything was strange and silent, and she seemed to be hundreds of miles away from anyone, but somehow she did not feel lonely at all. All that troubled her was her wish that she knew whether all the roses were dead, or if perhaps some of them had lived and might put out leaves and buds as the weather got warmer. She did not want it to be quite dead garden. If it were a quite alive garden, how wonderful it would be, and what thousands of roses would grow on every side. Her skipping rope had hung over her arm when she came in, and after she had walked about for a while, she thought she would skip round the whole garden, stopping when she wanted to look at things. There seemed to have been grass paths here and there, and in 1 or 2 corners there were alcoves of evergreen, with stone seats or tall moss-covered flower urns in them. As she came near the second of these alcoves, she stopped skipping. There had once been a flower bed in it, and she thought she saw something sticking out of the black earth, some sharp little pale green points. She remembered what Ben Weatherstaff had said, and she knelt down to look at them. Yes, they are tiny growing things, and they might be crocuses or snowdrops or daffodils, she whispered. She bent very close to them and sniffed the fresh scent of damp earth. She liked it very much. Perhaps there are some other ones coming up in other places, she said. I will go all over the garden and look. She did not skip, but walked. She went slowly and kept her eyes on the ground. She looked in the old border beds and among the grasses, and after she had gone round, trying to miss nothing, she had found ever so many more sharp, pale green points, and she had become quite excited again. "It isn't a quite dead garden," she cried out softly to herself. "Even if the roses are dead, there are other things alive." She did not know anything about gardening, but the grass seemed so thick in some places where the green points were pushing their way through that she thought they did not seem to have enough room to grow. She searched about until she found a rather sharp piece of wood, and knelt down and dug and weeded out the weeds and grass until she made nice little clear places round them. "Now they look as if they could breathe," she said, after she had finished with the first ones. "I'm going to do ever so many more. I'll do all I can see. If I haven't time today, I can come tomorrow." She went from place to place and dug and weeded and enjoyed herself so immensely that she was led on from bed to bed and into the grass under the trees. The exercise made her so warm that she first threw her coat off and then her hat, and without knowing it she was smiling down on the grass and the pale green points all the time. Robin was tremendously busy. He was very much pleased to see gardening begun in his own estate. He had often wondered at Ben Weatherstaff, where gardening is done, all sorts of delightful things to eat are turned up with the soil. Now here was this new kind of creature who was not half Ben's size, and yet it had the sense to come into his garden and begin at once. Mistress Mary worked in her garden until it was time to go to her midday dinner. They would call lunch dinner and dinner supper. In fact, she was rather late in remembering, and when she put on her coat and hat and picked up her skipping rope, she could not believe that she had been working 2 or 3 hours. She had been actually happy all the time, and dozens of the tiny, pale green points were to be seen in cleared places, looking twice as cheerful as they had looked before when the grass and weeds had been smothering them. "I shall come back this afternoon," she said, looking all round at her new kingdom, and speaking to the trees and the rose bushes as if they heard her. Then she ran lightly across the grass, pushed open the slow old door, and slipped through it under the ivy. She had such red cheeks and such bright eyes, and ate such a dinner that Martha was delighted. "2 pieces of meat and 2 helps of rice pudding," she said. "And Mother will be pleased when I tell her what the skipping rope's done for thee." In the course of her digging with her pointed stick, Mistress Mary had found herself digging up a sort of white root rather like an onion. She had put it back in its place and patted the earth carefully down on it, and just now she wondered if Martha could tell her what it was. "Martha," she said, "what are those white roots that look like onions?" "They're bulbs," answered Martha. "Lots of spring flowers grow from 'em. The very little ones are snowdrops and crocuses, and the big ones are narcissuses and jonquils and daffodillies. The biggest of all is lilies and purple flags. Oh, they are nice. Dicken's got a whole lot of 'em planted in our bit of garden." "Does Dicken know all about them?" asked Mary, a new idea taking possession of her. "Our Dicken can make a flower grow out of a brick walk. Mother says he just whispers things out of the ground." "Do bulbs live a long time? Would they live years and years if no one's helping them?" inquired Mary anxiously. "They're things that helps themselves," said Martha. "That's why poor people can afford to have 'em. If you don't trouble 'em, most of 'em will work way underground for a lifetime and spread out and have little ones. There's a place in the park woods where there's snowdrops by thousands. They're the prettiest sight in Yorkshire when the spring comes. No one knows when they was first planted." "I wish the spring was here now," said Mary. "I want to see all the things that grow in England." She had finished her dinner and had gone to her favorite seat on the hearthrug. I wish I had a little spade, she said. Whatever does thou want the spade for? Asked Martha, laughing. Art thou going to take it to Dicken? I must tell mother that too. Sorry. Mary looked at the fire and pondered again. She must be careful if she meant to keep her secret kingdom. She wasn't doing any harm, but if Mr. Craven found out about the open door, he would be fearfully angry and get a new key and lock it up forevermore. She really could not bear that. This is such a big, lonely place, she said slowly, as if she were turning matters over in her mind. The house is lonely, and the park is lonely, and the gardens are lonely. So many places seem shut up. I never did many things in India, but there were more people to look at. Natives and soldiers marching by, and sometimes bands playing, and my Ayah told me stories. There's no one to talk to here except you and Ben Weatherstaff, and you have to do your work, and Ben Weatherstaff won't speak to me often. I thought if I had a little spade I could dig somewhere as he does, and I might make a little garden if he would give me some seeds. Mary's face quite brightened up. There now, she exclaimed. If that wasn't one of the things Mother said. She says there's such a lot of room in that place. Why don't they give her a bit of her for herself, even if she doesn't plant nothing but parsley and radishes? She'd dig and rake away and be right down happy over it. Them was the very words she said. Were they? Said Mary. How many things she knows, doesn't she? Yes, said Martha. It's like she says, woman as brings up 12 children learns something besides her ABCs. Children's as good as arithmetics to set you finding out things. How much would a spade cost? A little one, Mary asked. Well, was Martha's reflective answer, at Thwaite Village there's a shop and I saw little garden sets with a spade and a rake and a fork all tied together for 2 shillings. And they was stout enough to work with, too. I've got more than that in my purse, said Mary. Mrs. Morrison gave me 5 shillings, and Mrs. Medlock gave me some money for Mr. Craven. Did you remember thee that much? Exclaimed Martha. Mrs. Medlock said I was to have 1 shilling a week to spend. She gives me one every Saturday. I didn't know what to spend it on. My word, that's riches, said Martha. If I can buy anything in the world thou wants. The rent of our cottage is only 1 and 3 pence, and it's like pulling eye teeth to get it. Now just thought of something, putting her hands on her hips. What? Said Mary eagerly. In the shop at Thwaite they sell packages of flower seeds for 1 penny each, and our Dicken, he knows which is the prettiest ones and how to make 'em grow. He walks over to Thwaite many a day just for the fun of it. Dost thou know how to print letters? She said suddenly. I know how to write, Mary answered. Martha shook her head. Our Dicken can only read printin'. If I could print, we could write a letter to him and ask him to go and buy the garden tools and the seeds at the same time. Printing is, I guess writing they mean cursive, and printing would be, I guess, not cursive or something. I think it was, my sister was watching something where they were talking about the things that you learn in school that later do you no good, and one of the things they said was cursive, and I just laughed and I said, I use cursive all the time. In fact, my handwriting I'm very proud of my handwriting, as you can see up in my little thing. And at the bookstore where I work, we make a lot of handwritten notes, so it's very important to write clearly. I think that's one of the things that I'm glad that I was taught, not only printing, but also cursive and Denilian. Denilian isn't something that really people know about anymore. It's kind of like a cross between printing and cursive. I guess you could say it's kind of like italics. Yeah, I write mostly in Denalian now. Let's see. Where were we? There we go. Oh, you're a good girl, Mary cried. You are, really. I didn't know you were so nice. I know I can print letters if I try. Let's ask Mrs. Medlock for a pen and ink and some paper. I've got some of my own, said Martha. I bought 'em so I could print a bit of a letter to Mother of a Sunday. I'll go and get it. She ran out of the room, and Mary stood by the fire and twisted her little... Oh, that was the wrong people speaking. There we go. Oh, you're a good girl, Mary cried. You are, really. I didn't know you were so nice. I know I can print letters if I try. Let's ask Mrs. Medlock for a pen and ink and some paper. I've got some of my own, said Martha. I bought 'em so I could print a bit of a letter to Mother on a Sunday. I'll go and get it. I thought it was weird for Mary to want to write her mother a letter. But you never know. She ran out of the room, and Mary stood by the fire and twisted her thin little hands together with sheer pleasure. If I have a spade, she whispered, I can make the earth nice and soft and dig up weeds. If I have seeds, I can make flowers grow the garden. I can make flowers grow. The garden won't be dead at all. It will come alive. She did not go out again that afternoon, because when Martha returned with her pen and ink and paper, she was obliged to clear the table and carry the plates and dishes downstairs, and when she got into the kitchen, Mrs. Medlock was there and told her to do something, so Mary waited for what seemed to her a long time before she came back. Then it was a serious piece of work to write to Dicken. Mary had been taught very little because her governess had disliked her so much too much to stay with her. She could not spell particularly well, but she found that she could print letters when she tried. This was the letter Martha dictated to her. My dear Dicken, this comes hoping to find you well, as it leaves me at present. Miss Mary has plenty of money, and will you go to Thwaite and buy her some flower seeds and a set of garden tools to make a flower bed. Pick the prettiest ones and easy to grow, because she has never done it before and lived in India, which is different. Give my love to Mother and every one of you. Miss Mary is going to tell me a lot more, so that on my next day out you can hear about elephants and camels and gentlemen going hunting lions and tigers. Your loving sister, Martha Phoebe Sowerby. We'll put the money in the envelope, and I'll get the butcher boy to take it in his cart. He's a great friend of Dicken's, said Martha. How shall I get the things when Dicken buys them? Oh, he'll bring it to you himself. He'll like to walk over this way. Oh, exclaimed Maria, then I shall see him. I never thought I should see Dicken. Dost thou want to see him? Asked Martha suddenly, for Mary had looked so pleased. Yes, I do. I never saw a boy foxes and crows loved. I want to see him very much. Martha gave a little start, as if she remembered something. Now to think, she broke out, to think of me forgetting that there. And I thought I was going to tell you first thing this morning. I asked Mother. She said she'd ask Mrs. Medlock her own self. Do you mean, Mary began. I said Tuesday. Ask her if you might be driving over to our cottage some day and have a bit of Mother's hot oat cake and butter and a glass of milk. It seemed as if all the interesting things were happening in one day. To think of going over the moor in the daylight and when the sky was blue. To think of going into the cottage which held 12 children. Does she think Mrs. Medlock would let me go? She asked quite anxiously. Aye, she thinks she would. She knows what a tidy woman Mother is, and how clean she keeps the cottage. If I went, I should see your mother as well as Dicken, said Mary, thinking it over, and liking the idea very much. She doesn't seem to be like mothers in India. Her work in the garden and the excitement of the afternoon ended by making her feel quiet and thoughtful. Martha stayed with her until tea time, but they sat in comfortable quiet and talked very little. But just before Martha went downstairs for the tea tray, Mary asked a question. "Martha," she said, "the scullery maid had the toothache again today." Martha certainly started slightly. "What makes thee ask that?" she said. "Because when I waited so long for you to come back, I opened the door and walked down the corridor to see if you were coming, and I heard that far-off crying again, just as we heard it the other night. There was no wind today, so you see it couldn't have been the wind." Said Martha restlessly. "I mustn't go walking in corridors and listening. Mr. Craven would be that there angry. There's no knowing what he'd do." "I wasn't listening," said Mary. "I was just waiting for you, and I heard it. That's 3 times. "My word, there's Mrs. Medlock's bell," said Martha, and she almost ran out of the room. "It's the strangest house anyone ever lived in," said Mary drowsily, as she dropped her head on the cushioned seat of the armchair near her. Fresh air and digging and skipping rope had made her feel so comfortably tired that she fell asleep. Must be nice to not have allergies. Chapter 10. Dicken. The sun shone down for nearly a week on the secret garden. The secret garden was what Mary had called it when she was thinking of it. She liked the name, and she liked still more the feeling that when its beautiful old walls shut her in, no one knew where she was. It seemed almost like being shut out of the world in some fairy place. The few books she had read and liked had been fairy storybooks, and she had read of secret gardens in some of the stories. Sometimes people went to sleep in them for 100 years, which she had thought must be rather stupid. She had no intention of going to sleep, and, in fact, she was becoming wider awake every day which passed at Misselthwaite. She was beginning to like to be out of doors. She no longer hated the wind, but enjoyed it. She could run faster and longer, and she could skip up to 100. The bulbs in the secret garden must have been much astonished. Such nice, clear places were made round them that they had all the breathing space they wanted, and really, if Mistress Mary had known it, they began to cheer up under the dark earth and work tremendously. The sun could get at them and warm them, and when the rain came down, it could reach them at once, so they began to feel very much alive. Mary was an odd, determined little person, and now she had something interesting to be determined about. She was very much absorbed indeed. She worked and dug and pulled up weeds steadily, only becoming more pleased with her work every hour instead of tiring of it. It seemed to her like a fascinating sort of play. She found many more of the sprouting pale green points than she had ever hoped to find. They seemed to be starting up everywhere, and each day she was sure she found the tiny new ones. Some so tiny that they barely peeped above the earth. There were so many that she remembered what Martha had said about the snowdrops by the thousands, and about bulbs spreading and making new ones. These had been left to themselves for 10 years, and perhaps they had spread, like the snowdrops, into thousands. She wondered how long it would be before they showed that they were flowers. Sometimes she stopped digging to look at the garden and try to imagine what it would be like when it was covered with thousands of lovely things in bloom. During that next week of sunshine, she became more intimate with Ben Weatherstaff. She surprised him several times by seeming to start up beside him as if she sprang out of the earth. The truth was that she was afraid that he would pick up his tools and go away if he saw her coming, so she always walked toward him as silently as possible. But in fact he did not object to her as strongly as he had at first. Perhaps he was secretly rather flattered by her evident desire for his elderly company. Then, also, she was more civil than she had been. He did not know that when she first saw him, she spoke to him as she would have spoken to a native, and had not known that a cross, sturdy old Yorkshireman was not accustomed to salaam to their masters, and he merely commanded by them to do things. Again, time and culture, unfortunately, taught bad things. "Thou'rt like the robin," he said to her one morning when he lifted his head and saw her standing by them. "I never knows when I shall see thee, or which side thou'll come from." "He's friends with me now," said Mary. "That's like him," snapped Ben Weatherstaff, "making up to women folk just for vanity and flightiness. There's nothing he wouldn't do for the sake of showing off and flirting his tail feathers. He's as full of pride as an egg's full of meat." He very seldom talked much, and sometimes did not even answer Mary's question, except by a grunt. But this morning he said more than usual. He stood up and rested one hob-nailed boot on the top of his spade, while he looked her over. "How long has thou been here?" he jerked out. "I think it's about a month," she answered. "It's beginning to do Misselthwaite credit," he said. "It's a bit fatter than I was, and thou's not quite so yeller. Thou looked like a young plucked crow when thou first came into this garden. Thinks I to myself, I never set eyes on an uglier, sour-faced young un." Mary was not vain, and she had never thought much of her looks, so she was not greatly disturbed. "I know I'm fatter," she said. "My stockings are getting tighter. They used to make wrinkles. Here's the robin, Ben Weatherstaff." There indeed was the robin, and she thought he looked nicer than ever. His red waistcoat was as glossy as satin, and he flirted his wings and tails, and tilted his head, and hopped about all sorts of lively graces. He seemed determined to make Ben Weatherstaff admire him, but Ben was sarcastic. "Ah, there thou art," he said. "Thou can put up with me for a bit some time, and thou's got no one better. Thou's been reddening up thy waistcoat and polishing thy feathers this 2 weeks. I know what thou's up to. Thou's courting some bold young madam somewhere, telling thy lies to her about being the finest cocked robin on Misselmore, and ready to fight all the rest of 'em." "Oh, look at him!" exclaimed Mary. The robin was evidently in a fascinating, bold mood. He hopped closer and closer and looked at Ben Weatherstaff more and more engagingly. He flew on to the nearest currant bush and tilted his head and sang a little song right at him. "Thinks thou get over me by doing that?" said Ben, wrinkling his face up in such a way that Mary felt sure he was trying not to look pleased. "Thou thinks no one could stand out against thee? That's what thou thinks?" The robin spread his wings. Mary could scarcely believe her eyes. He flew right up to the handle of Ben Weatherstaff's spade and alighted on top of it. Then the old man's wrinkled face wrinkled itself slowly into a new expression. He stood still, as if he were afraid to breathe, as if he would not have stirred for the world, lest this robin should start away. He spoke quite in a whisper. "Well, I'm danged," he said as softly as if he were saying something quite different. "Thou does know how to get at the chap, thou does. That's fair unearthly, that's so knowing." And he stood without stirring, almost without drawing his breath, until the robin gave another flirt of his wings and flew away. Then they stood looking at the handle of the spade as if there might be magic in it, and then he began to dig again and said nothing for several minutes. Because he kept breaking into a slow grin now and then, Mary was not afraid to talk to him. "Have you a garden of your own?" she asked. "No, I'm a batch elder and lodge with Martin at the gate." "If you had one," said Mary, "what would you plant? Cabbages and taters and onions?" "But if you wanted to make a flower garden," persisted Mary, "what would you plant?" "Bulbs and sweet-smelling things, but mostly roses." Mary's face lighted up. "Do you like roses?" she said. Ben Weatherstaff rooted up a weed and threw it aside before he answered. "Oh, yes, I do. I was learned that by a young lady I was gardener to. She had a lot in a place she was fond of, and she loved 'em like they was children, as robins. I've seen her bend over and kiss 'em." He dragged out another weed and scowled at it. "That there's much as 10 year ago." "Where's she now?" asked Mary, much interested. "Heaven," he answered, and drove his spade deep into the soil, according to what parson says. "What happened to the roses?" Mary asked again, more interested than ever. "They was left to themselves." Mary was becoming quite excited. "Do they quite die? Do roses die when they are left to themselves?" she ventured. "Well, I'd got to like 'em, and I liked her, and she liked 'em," Ben Weatherstaff admitted reluctantly. "Once or twice a year, I go and work at 'em a bit, prune 'em and dig about the roots. They run wild. They was in rich soil, so some of 'em lived." "When they have no leaves and look gray and brown and dry, how can you tell whether they are dead or alive?" inquired Mary. "Wait till the spring gets at 'em. Wait till the sun shines and the rain on the rain, and the rain falls on the sunshine, and they'll find out." How?" cried Mary, forgetting to be careful. "Look along the twigs and branches. If thou sees a bit of brown lumps swelling here and there, watch it after the warm rain, and see what happens." He stopped suddenly and looked curiously at her eager face. "Why dost thou care so much about roses and such all of a sudden?" he demanded. Mistress Mary felt her face grow red. She was almost afraid to answer. I want to play that I have a garden of my own," she stammered. There's nothing for me to do. I have nothing, and no one." "Well," said Ben Weatherstaff slowly as he watched her, "that's true, thou hasn't." He said it in such an odd way that Mary wondered if he was actually a little sorry for her. She had never felt sorry for herself. She had only felt tired and cross because she disliked people and things so much. But now the world seemed to be changing and getting nicer. If no one found out about the secret garden, she should enjoy herself always. She stayed with him for 10 or 15 minutes longer and asked him as many questions as she dared. He answered every one of them in his queer grunting way, and he did not seem really cross and did not pick up his spade and leave her. He said something about roses just as she was going away, and it reminded her of the ones he had said he had been fond of. "Do you go and see those other roses now?" she asked. "Up in this year. My rheumatics made me too stiff in the joints." He said it in his grumbling voice, and then quite suddenly he seemed to get angry with her, though she did not see why he should. "Now look here," he said sharply. "Don't thou ask so many questions. Thou'rt the worst wench for asking questions if ever I come across. Get thee gone and play thee. I've done talking for today." And he said it so crossly that she knew there was not the least use in staying another minute. She went skipping slowly down the outside walk, thinking him over and saying to herself that, queer as it was, there was another person whom she liked in spite of his coarseness. She liked old Ben Weatherstaff. Yes, she did like him. She always wanted to try to make him talk to her. Also, she began to believe that he knew everything in the world about flowers. There was a laurel-hedged walk which curved round the secret garden and ended in a gate which opened into the wood in the park. She thought she would skip round this walk and look into the wood and see if there were any rabbits hopping about. She enjoyed the skipping very much, and when she reached the little gate she opened it and went through because she heard a low, peculiar whistling sound and wanted to find out what it was. It was a very strange thing indeed. She quite caught her breath as she stopped to look at it. A boy was sitting under a tree with his back against it, playing on a rough wooden pipe. He was a funny-looking boy, about 12. He looked very clean, and his nose turned up, and his cheeks were as red as poppies, and never had Mistress Mary seen such round and such blue eyes in any boy's face. And on the trunk of the tree he leaned against, a brown squirrel was clinging and watching him, and from behind a bush near by a cock pheasant was delicately stretching his neck to peep out, and quite near him were 2 rabbits sitting up and sniffing with tremulous noses, and actually it appeared as if they were all drawing near to watch him and listen to the strange, low little call his pipe seemed to make. When he saw Mary, he held up his hand and spoke to her in a voice almost as low as and rather like his piping. "Don't thou move," he said. "It'll flight 'em." Mary remained motionless. He stopped playing his pipe and began to rise from the ground. He moved so slowly that it scarcely seemed as though he were moving at all, but at last he stood on his feet, and then the squirrel scampered back up into the branches of the tree, the pheasant withdrew his head, and the rabbits dropped on all fours and began to hop away, though not at all as if they were frightened. "I'm Dicken," the boy said. "I know thou'rt Miss Mary." Then Mary realized that somehow she had known at first that he was Dicken. Who else would have been charming rabbits and pheasants as the natives charm snakes in India? He had a wide, red, curving mouth, and his smile spread all over his face. "I got up slow," he exclaimed, "because if thou makes a quick move it startles them. A body as moves gentle and speaks low, and when wild things is about." "Oh, a body has to move gentle and slow, and speak low when wild things is about?" He did. Goodness, I am tumbling over words. He did not speak to her as if they had never seen each other before, but as if he knew her quite well. Mary knew nothing about boys, and she spoke to him a little stiffly because she felt rather shy. "Did you get Martha's letter?" she asked. He nodded his curly, rust-colored head. "That's why I come." He stopped to pick up something which had been lying on the ground beside him when he piped. "I've got the garden tools. There's a little spade and rake and a fork and hoe. Hey, they are good uns. There's a trowel, too, and the woman at the shop threw in a packet of white poppy and one of blue larkspur when I bought the other seeds." "Will you show the seeds to me?" Mary said. She wished she could talk as he did. His speech was so quick and easy. It sounded as if he liked her and was not the least afraid she would not like him, though he was only a common moor boy in patched clothes, with a funny face and a rough, rusty red head. As she came closer to him, she noticed that there was a clean, fresh scent of heather and grass and leaves about him, almost as if he were made of them. She liked it very much, and when she looked into his funny face with the red cheeks and round blue eyes, she forgot that she had felt shy. "Let us sit down on this log and look at 'em," she said. They sat down, and he took a clumsy little brown paper package out of his coat pocket. He untied the string, and inside there were ever so many neater and smaller packages with a picture of a flower on each of them. "There's a lot of mignonette and poppies," he said. "Mignonette's the sweetest smelling thing as grows, and it'll grow wherever you cast it, same as poppies will. Them as'll come up and bloom if you just whistle to 'em. Them's the nicest of all." He stopped and turned his head quickly, his poppy-cheeked face lighting up. The first time I read this, of course, I was only familiar with California poppies, which are very much orange-colored flower, but poppies elsewhere are mostly known for being very red. So, took some adjusting in the brain there. He stopped and turned his head quickly, his poppy-cheeked face lighting up. "Where's that robin is calling us?" he said. The chirp came from a thick holly bush, bright with scarlet berries, and Mary thought she knew whose it was. "Is it really calling us?" she asked. "Aye," said Dicken, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "He's calling someone he's friends with. That's same as saying, 'Here I am, look at me. I wants a bit of a chat.' And there he is in the bush. Whose is he?" "He's been Weatherstaff's, but I think he knows me a little," answered Mary. "He knows thee," said Dicken in a low voice again, "and he likes thee. He's took thee on. He'll tell me all about thee in a minute." He moved quite close to the bush with the slow movement Mary had noticed before, and then he made a sound almost like the robin's own twitter. The robin listened a few seconds intently, and then answered quite as if he were replying to a question. "Aye, he's a friend of yours," chuckled Dicken. "Do you think he is?" cried Mary eagerly. She did so want to know. "Do you think he really likes me?" "I wouldn't come near thee if he didn't," answered Dicken. "Birds is rare choosers, and a robin can flout a body worse than a man. See, he's making up to ye now. Canna thou see, chap, he's saying." And it really seemed as if it must be true. He so sidled and twittered and tilted as he hopped on his bush. "Do you understand everything birds say?" said Mary. Dicken's grin spread until he seemed all wide, red, curving mouth, and he rubbed his rough head. "I think I do, and they think I do," he said. "I've lived on the moor with 'em so long. I've watched 'em break shell and come out and fledge and learn to fly and begin to sing till I think I'm one of them. Sometimes I think p'raps I am a bird or a fox or a rabbit or a squirrel or even a beetle. Then I don't know it, and I don't know it." He laughed and came back to the log and began to talk about the flower seeds again. He told her what they looked like when they were flowers. He told her how to plant them and watch them and feed and water them. "See here," he said suddenly, turning round to look at her. "I'll plant them for thee myself. Where's thy garden?" Mary's thin hands clutched each other as they lay on her lap. She did not know what to say, so for a few minutes she said nothing. She had never thought of this. She felt miserable, and she felt as if she went red and then pale. "I's got a bit of garden, hasna?" Dicken said. It was true that she had turned red and then pale. Dicken saw her do it, and as she still said nothing, he began to be puzzled. "Couldn't they give you a bit?" he said. "Hasn't got any?" She held her hands tighter and turned her eyes toward him. "I don't know anything about boys," she said slowly. "Could you keep a secret if I told you one? It's a great secret. I don't know what I should do if anyone found it out. I believe I should die." She said the last sentence quite fiercely. Dicken looked more puzzled than ever and even rubbed his hand over his rough head again. But he answered quite good-humoredly. "I'm keeping secrets all the time," he said. "If I couldn't keep secrets from the other lads, secrets about foxes' cubs, and birds' nests, and wild things' holes, they'd be not safe on the moor. I can keep secrets." Mistress Mary did not mean to put out her hand and clutch his sleeve, but she did it. "I've stolen a garden," she said very fast. "It isn't mine, it isn't anybody's. Nobody wants it, nobody cares for it, nobody ever goes into it. Perhaps everything is dead in it already, I don't know." She began to feel hot and as contrary as she had ever felt in her life. "I don't care. I don't care. Nobody has any right to take it from me when I care about it, and they don't. They're letting it die all shut in by itself," she ended passionately, and she threw her arms over her face and burst out crying. Poor little Mistress Mary. Dicken's curious blue eyes grew rounder and rounder. "Hey," he said, drawing his exclamation out slowly, and the way he did it meant both wonder and sympathy. "I've nothing to do," said Mary. "Nothing belongs to me. I found it myself, and I got into it myself, and I was only just like the robin, and they wouldn't take it from the robin." "Where is it?" asked Dicken in a dropped voice. Mistress Mary got up from the log at once. She knew she felt contrary again and obstinate, and she did not care at all. She was imperious, and at the same time hot and sorrowful. "Come with me, and I'll show you," she said. She led him round the laurel path and to the walk where the ivy grew so thickly. Dicken followed her with a queer, almost pitying look on his face. He felt as if he were being led to look at some strange bird's nest and must move softly. When she stepped to the wall and lifted the hanging ivy, he started. There was a door, and Mary pushed it slowly open, and they passed in together. And then Mary stood and waved her hand round defiantly. "It's this," she said. "It's a secret garden, and I'm the only one in the world who wants it to be alive." Dicken looked round and round about it, and round again. "Hey," he almost whispered, "it is a queer pretty place. It's like as if a body was in a dream." Chapter 11. The Nest of the Missel Thrush. For 2 or 3 minutes he stood looking round him while Mary watched him, and then he began to walk about softly. Even more lightly than Mary had walked the first time she had found herself inside the 4 walls. His eyes seemed to be taking in everything, the gray trees with the gray creepers climbing over them and hanging from their branches, the tangle on the walls and among the grass, the evergreen alcoves with the stone seats and tall flower urns standing in them. "I never thought I'd see this place," he said at last in a whisper. "Did you know about it?" asked Mary. She had spoken aloud, and he made a sign to her. "We must talk low," he said, "or someone will hear us and wonder what's to do in here." "Oh, I forgot," said Mary, feeling frightened and putting her hand quietly against her mouth. "Did you know about the garden?" she asked again, when she had recovered herself. Dicken nodded. "Martha told me there was one as no one ever went inside," he answered. "Us used to wonder what it was like." He stopped and looked round at the lovely grey tangle about him, and his round eyes looked queerly happy. The nests as'll be there come springtime," he says. "It'll be the safest nesting place in England. No one never comin' near, and tangles of trees and roses to build in. I wonder what all the birds in the moor don't build here." Mistress Mary put her hand on his arm again without knowing it. "Will there be roses?" she whispered. "Can you tell? I thought perhaps they were all dead." "No, look at 'em all," he answered. "Look here." He stepped over to the nearest tree, an old one, with grey lichen all over its bark, but upholding a curtain of tangled sprays and branches. He took a thick knife out of his pocket and opened one of its blades. "There's lots of dead wood as ought to be cut off," he said, "and there's a lot of old wood, but it made some new last year. This year's a new bit," and he touched a shoot which looked brownish green itself brownish green itself instead of hard dry gray. Mary touched it herself in an eager, reverent way. "That one?" she said. "Is that one quite alive? Quite?" Dicken curved his wide, smiling mouth. "It's as wick as you and me," he said. Mary remembered that Martha had told her that wick meant alive or lively. "Oh, I'm glad it's wick," she cried out in her whisper. "I want them all to be wick. Let us go round the garden and count as many wick ones there are." She quite panted with eagerness, and Dicken was as eager as she was. They went from tree to tree and from bush to bush. Dicken carried his knife in his hand and showed her things which she thought wonderful. "They've run wild," he said, "but the strongest ones has fair thrived on it. It's the delicatest ones has dried out, but the ones has growed and spread till they's a wonder. See here." And he pulled down a thick, grey, dry-looking branch. "A body might think this was dead wood, but I don't believe it is, down to the root. I'll cut it low down and see." He knelt and with his knife cut the lifeless-looking branch through, not far above the earth. "There," he said exultantly. "I told thee so. There's green in that wood yet. Look at it." Mary was down on her knees before he spoke, gazing with all her might. "When it looks a bit greenish and juicy like that, it's wick," he exclaimed. "When the inside is dry and breaks easy, like this here piece I've cut off, it's done for. There's a big root here, and all this live wood sprung out of, and if the old wood's cut off and it's dug round and took care of, there'll be—" He stopped and lifted his face to look up at the climbing and hanging sprays about him. "There'll be a fountain of roses here in the summer." They went from bush to bush and from tree to tree. He was very strong and clever with his knife, and knew how to cut the dry and dead wood away, and could tell when an unpromising bough or twig had still green life in it. In the course of half an hour, Mary thought she could tell too, and when he cut through a lifeless-looking branch, she would cry out joyfully under her breath when she caught sight of the least shade of moist green. The spade and hoe and fork were very useful. He showed her how to use the fork when he dug about roots with the spade and stirred the earth and let the air in. They were working industriously round one of the biggest standard roses when he caught sight of something which made him utter an exclamation of surprise. "Why, oh, hello, thank you so much for the follow. I hope you're enjoying story time. We are almost about halfway through Secret Garden. If you wanted to watch the first part, that is on my VOD and also on my YouTube. I'll really quickly, because I don't think Corell is here today. Corell is my fabulous, fabulous mod. So, there's that. And that. So, that has all of the YouTube has all of my story times. I have been a bit lazy about putting them into the playlists, but yeah. Anyways, I'll go ahead and continue, and we can chat at the end of the chapter. Where was it? They were working industriously round one of the biggest standard roses when he caught sight of something which made him utter an exclamation of surprise. "Why," he cried, pointing to the grass a few feet away. "Who did that there?" It was one of Mary's own little clearings round the pale green points. "I did it," said Mary. "Why, I thought that didn't know nothing about garden," he exclaimed. "I don't," she answered, "but they were so little, and the grass was so thick and strong, and they looked as if they had no room to breathe, so I made a place for them. I didn't know what they were." Dicken went and knelt down by them, smiling his wide smile. "Thou was right," he said. "The gardener couldn't have told thee better. They'll grow now like Jack's beanstalk. They're crocuses and snowdrops, and these here is narcissuses." He turned to another patch. "And here's taffy-dandelions. They will be a sight." He ran from one clearing to another. "Thou's done a lot of work for such a little wench," she said, looking her over. "Well, I'm growing fatter," said Mary, "and I'm growing stronger. I used always to be tired." "Oh, hey, Snockings, are you going to come up? Come on. Yeah. This, by the way, is Snockings. She is the oldest of my two cats. Hey, Snockings. Yeah. She'll sometimes join us for story time. And you'll make it hard to read, but I don't mind. "I'm growing fatter," said Mary, "and I'm growing stronger. I used always to be tired. When I dig, I'm not tired at all. I like to smell the earth when it's turned up." "It's rare good for thee," he said, nodding his head wisely. "There's naught as nice as the smell of good clean earth, except the smell of fresh growing things, and the rain falls on 'em. I get out of them on the moor many a day when it's raining, and I lie under a bush and listen to the soft swish of drops and the heather, and I just— Snockings, you're making it hard. And I just sniff and sniff and my nose and fair quivers like a rabbit's mother. Sorry. And my nose and fair quivers like a rabbit's, mother says. Do you ever catch a cold? Inquired Mary, gazing at him. She had never seen such a funny boy, or such a nice one. Not me, he said, grinning. I never catched cold since I was born. Snackings, your fur is everywhere. I wasn't brought up nesh enough. I've chased about the moor in all weathers, same as the rabbits does. Mother says I've sniffed up too much fresh air for 12 year to ever get to sniffling with cold. I'm as tough as a whitethorn knobstick. He was working all the time he was talking, and Mary was following him and helping him with her fork and the trowel. There's a lot of work to do here, he said once, looking about quite exultantly. Will you come again and help me to do it? Mary begged. I'm sure I can help too. I can dig and pull up weeds and do whatever you tell me. Oh, do come, Dicken. I'll come every day if thou wants me, rain or shine, he answered stoutly. It's the best fun I ever had in my life, shut in here and wakening up a garden. If you will come, said Mary, if you will help me to make it alive, I don't know what I'll do, she ended helplessly. What could you do for a boy like that? Well, I'll tell you what thou'll do, said Dicken with his happy grin. Thou'll get fat, and thou'll get as hungry as a young fox, and thou'll learn how to talk to the robin same as I do, and we'll have a lot of fun. He began to walk about, looking up in the trees and at the walls and bushes with a thoughtful expression. I wouldn't want to make it look like a gardener's garden, all clipped and spick and span, would you? He said. It's nicer like this, with things running wild and swinging and catching hold of each other. Don't let us make it tidy, said Mary anxiously. It wouldn't seem like a secret garden if it was tidy. Dicken stood rubbing his rusty red head with a rather puzzled look. It took me quite a bit of time to find a good garden picture that wasn't tidy, because I knew it was very important. It had to be just running wild like that. But I think this picture works, don't you? Dicken stood rubbing his rusty red head with a rather puzzled look. It's a secret garden, sure enough, he said. But seems like someone besides the robin must have been in here. Must have been in it since it was shut up 10 years ago. But the door was locked and the key was buried, said Mary. No one could get in. That's true, he answered. It's a queer place. Seems to me as if there's a bit of pruning done here and there, later than 10 years ago. But how could it have been done? Said Mary. He was examining a branch of a standard rose, and he shook his head. How could it? He murmured. With the door locked and the key buried? Mistress Mary always felt that however many years she lived, she should never forget that first morning when her garden began to grow. Of course it did seem to begin to grow for her that morning. When Dicken began to clear places to plant seeds, she remembered when Basil had sung at her when he wanted to tease her. Are there many flowers that look like bells? She inquired. Lilies of the valley does, he answered, digging away with a trowel. And there's Canterbury bells and campanulas. Let's plant some, said Mary. There's a lily of the valley here already, I saw him. They'll have growed too close, and we'll have to separate 'em, but there's plenty. The other ones take 2 years to bloom from seed, but I can bring you some bits of plants from our cottage garden. Why dost thou want 'em? Then Mary told him about Basil and his brothers and sisters in India, and how she had hated them, and of their calling her Mistress Mary quite contrary. They used to dance round and sing at me. They sang, Mistress Mary quite contrary, how does your garden grow, with silver bells and cockle shells and marigolds all in a row. I just remember it, and it made me wonder if there were really flowers like silver bells. She frowned a little and gave her trowel a rather spiteful dig into the earth. I wasn't as contrary as they were. But Dicken laughed. He said, and as he crumbled the rich black soil, she saw he was sniffing up the scent of it. There doesn't seem to be no need for no one to be contrary when there's flowers and such like, and such lots of friendly wild things running about making homes for themselves, and building nests and singing and whistling, does there? Mary, kneeling by him, holding the seeds, looked at him and stopped frowning. Dicken, she said, you were as nice as Martha said you were. I like you, and you make the 5th person. I never thought I should like 5 people. Dicken sat up on his heels, as Martha did when she was polishing the grate. He did look funny and delightful, Mary thought, with his round blue eyes and red cheeks and happy-looking turned-up nose. Only 5 folk as thou likes, he said. Who's the other 4? Your mother and Martha? Mary checked them off on her fingers. And the Robin and Ben Weatherstaff. Dicken laughed as he was, so that he was obliged to stifle the sound by putting his arm over his mouth. I know thou thinks I'm queer, lad, he said, but I think thou art the queerest little lass I ever saw. Then Mary did a strange thing. She leaned forward and asked him a question she had never dreamed of asking anyone before. And she tried to ask it in Yorkshire because that was his language, and in India a native was always pleased if you knew this speech. Does thou like me? She asked. Yea, he said heartily, that a does. I like thee wonderful, and so does the robin, I do believe. That's 2 then, said Mary. That's 2 for me. And then they began to work harder than ever and more joyfully. Mary was startled and sorry when she heard the big clock in the courtyard strike the hour of her midday dinner. I shall have to go, she said mournfully. And you will have to go too, won't you? Dicken grinned. My dinner's easy to carry about with me, he said. Mother always lets me put a bit of something in my pocket. He picked up his coat from the grass and brought out of a pocket a lumpy little bundle tied in a quite clean, coarse, blue and white handkerchief. It held 2 thick pieces of bread with a slice of something laid between them. It's oftenest not the bread, he said, but I've got a fine slice of fat bacon with it today. Mary thought it looked a queer dinner, but he seemed ready to enjoy it. Run and get thy victuals, he said. I'll be done with mine first. I'll get some more work done before I start back home. He sat down with his back against the tree. I'll call the robin up, he said, and give him the rind of the bacon to peck at. They likes the bit of fat wonderful. Mary could scarcely bear to leave him. Suddenly it seemed as if he might be a sort of wood fairy who might be gone when she came into the garden again. He seemed too good to be true. She knelt slowly, halfway to the door in the wall, and then she stopped and went back. Whatever happens, you would never tell? She said. His poppy-colored cheeks were distended with his first big bite of bread and bacon, but he managed to smile encouragingly. If thou was a missel thrush and showed me where thy nest was, dost thou think I'd tell anyone? Not me, he said. Thou'rt as safe as a missel thrush. And she was quite sure she was. Just going to take a little look at... We could probably do one more chapter, I think. Yeah. All right. We'll do one more chapter. Chapter 12. Might I have a bit of earth? Mary ran so fast that she was rather out of breath when she reached her room. Her hair was ruffled on her forehead, and her cheeks were bright pink. Her dinner was waiting on the table, and Martha was waiting near it. That's a bit late, she said. Where's thou been? I've seen Dicken, said Mary. I've seen Dicken. I knew he'd come, said Martha exultantly. How does thou like him? I think he's beautiful, said Mary in a determined voice. Martha looked rather taken aback, but she looked pleased. Well, she said, he's the best lad as ever was born, but I never thought he was handsome. His nose turns up too much. I like it to turn up. Always makes me think of Matt Damon. And his eyes is so round, said Martha, a trifle doubtful. Though they're nice colour. I like them round, said Mary, and they are exactly the colour of the sky over the moor. Martha beamed with satisfaction. Sorry, there's a gnat. Mother says he made him that colour with always looking up at the birds and the clouds. But he has got a big mouth, hasn't he now? I love his big mouth, said Mary obstinately. I wish mine were just like it. Martha chuckled delightedly. It looked rare and funny on thy bit of a face, she said. But I knowed it would be that way when I saw him. How did thou like the seeds and the garden tools? How did you know he brought them? Asked Mary. I never thought of him not bringing 'em. He'd be sure to bring 'em if they was in Yorkshire. He's such a trusty lad. Mary was afraid that she might begin to ask difficult questions, but she did not. She was very much interested in the seeds and gardening tools, and there was only one moment when Mary was frightened. This was when she began to ask where the flowers were to be planted. What did they ask about it? Who did they ask about it? She inquired. I haven't asked anybody yet, said Mary, hesitating. Well, I wouldn't ask the head gardener. He's too grand, Mr. Roach is. I've never seen him, said Mary. I've only seen under gardeners and Ben Weatherstaff. Well, if I was you, I'd ask Ben Weatherstaff, advised Martha. He's not half as bad as he looks, for all he's so crabbed. Mr. Craven lets him do what he likes because he was here when Mrs. Craven was alive, and he used to make her laugh. She likes him. Perhaps he'd find you a corner somewhere out of the way. If it was one of the out of the way and no one wanted it, no one could mind my having it, could they? Mary asked anxiously. There wouldn't be no reason, answered Martha. You wouldn't do no harm. Mary ate her dinner as quickly as she could, and when she rose from the table, she was going to run to her room to put on her hat again, but Martha stopped her. I've got something to tell you, she said. I thought I'd let you eat your dinner first. Mr. Craven came back this morning, and I think he wants to see you. Mary turned quite pale. Oh, she said, why? Why? He didn't want to see me when I came. I heard Pitcher say he didn't. Well, exclaimed Martha, Mrs. Medlock says it's because of Mother. She was walking to Thwaite Village and she met him. She'd never spoken to him before, but Mrs. Craven had been to our cottage 2 or 3 times. He'd forgot, but Mother hadn't, and she made bold to stop him. I don't know what she said to him about you, but she said something and put him in the mind to see you before he goes away again tomorrow. Oh, cried Mary. Is he going away again tomorrow? I am so glad. He's going for a long time. He mayn't be back till autumn or winter. He's going to travel in foreign places. He was always doing it. Oh, I'm so glad, said Mary thankfully. If he did not come back until winter, or even autumn, there would be no time to watch the secret garden come alive. There would be time to watch the secret garden come alive. Even if he found out then and took it away from her, she would at least have that much. When do you think you'll want to see? She did not finish the sentence, because the door opened and Mrs. Medlock walked in. She had on her best black dress and cap, and her collar was fastened with a large brooch with the picture of a man's face on it. It was a colored photograph of Mr. Medlock, who had died years ago, and she always wore it when she was dressed up. She looked nervous and excited. Your hair's rough, she said quickly. Go and brush it. Martha, help her to slip on her best dress. Mr. Craven sent me to bring her to him in his study. All the pink left Mary's cheeks. Her heart began to thump, and she felt herself changing into a stiff, plain, silent child again. She did not even answer Mrs. Medlock, but turned and walked into her bedroom, followed by Martha. She said nothing while her dress was changed, and her hair brushed, and after she was quite tidy, she followed Mrs. Medlock down the corridors in silence. What was there for her to say? She was obliged to go and see Mr. Craven, and he would not like her, and she would not like him. She knew what he would think of her. She was taken to a part of the house she had not been into before. At last Mrs. Medlock knocked at a door, and when someone said, "Come in," they entered the room together. The man was sitting in an armchair before the fire, and Mrs. Medlock spoke to him. "This is Mary, sir." Miss Mary, sorry. "This is Miss Mary, sir," said she. "You can go and leave her here. I will ring for you when I want you to take her away," said Mr. Craven. When she went out and closed the door, Mary could only stand waiting, a plain little thing, twisting her thin hands together. She could see that the man in the chair was not so much a hunchback as a man with a high, rather crooked shoulder, and he had black hair streaked with white. He turned his head over his high shoulders and spoke to her. "Come here," he said. Mary went to him. He was not ugly. His face would have been handsome if he had not been so miserable. He looked as if the sight of her worried and fretted him, and as if he did not know what in the world to do with her. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," answered Mary. "Do they take good care of you?" "Yes." He rubbed his forehead fretfully as he looked her over. "You are very thin," he said. "I am getting fatter," Mary answered in what she knew was her stiffest way. What an unhappy face he had. His black eyes seemed as if they scarcely saw her, as if they were seeing something else, and he could scarcely keep his thoughts upon her. "I forgot you," he said. "How could I remember you? I intended to send you a governess or a nurse or someone of that sort, but I forgot." "Please," began Mary, "please," and then the lump in her throat choked her. "What do you want to say?" he inquired. I'm too big for a nurse," said Mary, "and please don't make me have a governess yet." He rubbed his forehead again and stared at her. "That was what the Sowerby woman said," he muttered absent-mindedly. Then Mary gathered a scrap of courage. Is she Martha's mother?" she stammered. "Yes, I think so," he replied. "Well, she knows about children," said Mary. She has 12. She knows." He seemed to rouse himself. "What do you want to do?" "I want to play out of doors," Mary answered, hoping that her voice did not tremble. "I never liked it in India. It makes me hungry here, and I'm getting fatter." He was watching her. "Mrs. Sowerby said it would do you good." "Perhaps it will," he said. "She thought you had better get stronger before you had a governess." "It makes me feel strong when I play and the wind comes over the moor," argued Mary. "Where do you play?" he asked next. "Everywhere," gasped Mary. "Martha's mother sent me a skipping rope. I skip and run, and I look about to see if things are beginning to stick up out of the earth. I don't do any harm." "Don't look so frightened," he said in a worried voice. You could not do any harm, a child like you. You may do what you like." Mary put her hand up to her throat because she was afraid he might see the excited lump which she felt jump into it. She came a step nearer to him. "May I?" she said tremulously. Her anxious little face seemed to worry him more than ever. "Don't look so frightened," he exclaimed. "Of course you may. I am your guardian, though I am a poor one for any child. I cannot give you time or attention. I'm too ill and wretched and distracted, but I wish you to be happy and comfortable. I don't know anything about children, but Mrs. Medlock is to see that you have all you need. I sent for you today because Mrs. Sowerby said I ought to see you. Her daughter had talked about you. She thought you needed fresh air and freedom and running about." "She knows all about children," she said again, in spite of herself. "She ought to," said Mr. Craven. "I thought her rather bold to stop me on the moor, but she said Mrs. Craven has been kind to her." It seemed hard for him to speak his dead wife's name. "She's a respectable woman. Now I have seen you, I think she has said sensible things. Play out of doors as much as you like. It's a big place, and you may go where you like and amuse yourself as you like. Is there anything you want?" As if a sudden thought had struck him. "You want toys, books, dolls?" "Might I," quavered Mary, "might I have a bit of earth?" In her eagerness she did not realize how queer the words would sound, and that they were not the ones she had meant to say. Mr. Craven looked quite startled. Earth, he repeated. What do you mean? To plant seeds in, to make things grow, to see them come alive, Mary faltered. He gazed at her a moment and then passed his hand quickly over his eyes. Do you care about gardens so much? He said slowly. I didn't know about them in India, said Mary. I was always ill and tired, and it was too hot. I sometimes made little beds in the sand and stuck flowers in them, but here it is different. Mr. Craven got up and began to walk slowly across the room. A bit of earth, he said to himself, and Mary thought that somehow she must have reminded him of something. When he stopped and spoke to her, his dark eyes looked almost soft and kind. You can have as much earth as you want, he said. You remind me of someone else who loved the earth and things that grow. When you see a bit of earth you want, it's something like a smile. Take it, child, and make it come alive. May I take it from anywhere, if it's not wanted? Anywhere, he answered. There, you must go away. I'm tired. He touched the bell to call Mrs. Medlock. Goodbye, I shall be away all summer. Mrs. Medlock came so quickly that Mary thought she must have been waiting in the corridor. Mrs. Medlock, Mr. Craven said to her, now I have seen the child, I understand what Mrs. Sowerby meant. She must be less delicate before she begins lessons. Give her simple, healthy food. Let her run wild in the garden. Don't look after her too much. She needs liberty and fresh air and romping about. Mrs. Sowerby has to come and see her now and then, and she may sometimes go to the cottage. Mrs. Medlock looked pleased. She was relieved to hear that she need not look after Mary too much. She had felt her a tiresome charge, and had indeed seen as little of her as she dared. In addition to this, she was fond of Martha's mother. Thank you, sir, she said. Susan Sowerby and me went to school together. She's as sensible and good-hearted a woman as you'd find in a day's walk. I never had any children myself, and she's had 12, and there never was healthier or better ones. Miss Mary can get no harm from them. I'd always taken Susan Sowerby's advice about children myself. She's what you might call healthy-minded, if you understand me. I understand, Mr. Craven answered. Take Miss Mary away now and send Pitcher to me. When Mrs. Medlock left her at the end of her own corridor, Mary flew back to her room. She found Martha waiting there. Martha had, in fact, hurried back after she had removed the dinner service. I can have my garden, cried Mary. I may have it where I like. I'm not going to have a governess for a long time. Your mother is coming to see me, and I may go to your cottage. He says a little girl like me could do no harm, could not do any harm, and I may do what I like, anywhere. Yes, said Martha delightedly. That was nice of him, wasn't it? Martha, said Mary solemnly, he is really a nice man, only his face is so miserable, and his forehead is all drawn together. She ran as quickly as she could to the garden. She had been away for so much longer than she thought she should, and she knew Dicken would have to set out early on his 5-mile walk. When she slipped through the door under the ivy, she saw he was not working where she had left him. The gardening tools were laid together under a tree. She ran to them, looking all round the place, but there was no Dicken to be seen. He had gone away, and the secret garden was empty, except for the robin, who had just flown across the wall and sat on a standing rose bush watching her. He's gone, she said woefully. Oh, was he only a wood fairy? Something white fastened to the standard rose bush caught her eye. It was a piece of paper. In fact, it was the piece of letter she had printed for Martha to send to Dicken. It was fastened on the bush with a long thorn, and in a minute she knew Dicken had left it there. There were some roughly printed letters on it, and a sort of picture. At first she could not tell what it was. Then she saw it was meant for a nest with a bird sitting on it. Underneath were the printed letters, and they said, I will come back. Oh, that's actually amazing timing, because we are at almost exactly 4 o'clock, so we've reached the end of our story time for today. Let's see, does anybody have any suggestion for who we can raid? And I'll see if any of our friends are streaming right now. Alright. Ooh, a lot of people are streaming right now. We've got Shiny Wave. And let's see, Tetratum. Ooh. Somebody's playing Genshin Impact. I haven't played that in a while. And it's Lost Luna XO. Ooh, first year anniversary. Let us... Oh, thank you, John. It was so great to see you. It's been a while, so, you know, sometimes I wonder how you guys are doing out there. But I think we're going to raid Lost Luna XO. I think that's how it is spelled. Yes. All right. Oh, thank you. All right, let's get our raid message ready. All right, thank you again for hanging out with me. Again, this month's schedule is Fridays and Sundays, 2 to 4. Currently working, of course, through Secret Garden, and then I think I'm going to take a suggestion. Oh, goodness, I forget his name. But thinking of doing Walden by Henry David Thoreau next. So I will see you next time. Have a great week. Stay safe. Bye.